When we are examining the human scale of the climate crisis, we are examining humans in crisis. The notion of climate anxieties and climate traumas are emerging in the worlds of psychology and care, with increasing clinical frequency and increasing scholarship. Hello again, and welcome to Greetings Earthling, our focus on mental health. In this session, we have a dancer, biologist, polymath, a clinical psychologist who works explicitly in the intersection of art, climate, and psychology, and an expansive, free-thinking pan-psychologist whose writings have really inspired this discussion of what it means to reconcile mental health, trauma, and climate. One observation from me on how these panels have rolled out, that we might agree on the macro issues that humans are threatened as a species. However, the more we zero in on the human experience of actual people, the more disparate the opinions. And in a Broto experiment where we look at how disparate art and science ideas might come together and make hybridized new ideas, this is a good example. Thank you to our panelists for taking on a difficult subject and bringing on our viewers emergent new thinking. Before we get started, a special thank you to our critical and ongoing sponsors and private donors. As you know, Broto Art Climate Science is a program of the Cape Cod Center for Sustainability, which is a registered 501c3 charity. We have done this program online and for free. But that means we have to rely on our attendees to support us financially, especially for us tiny nonprofits in the COVID era when funding has evaporated. If you can help us, even with a small donation in support of this program and future art sci initiatives by Broto, please click the link in the pop-up. Now, on with our panel inspired by global citizenship. Thank you for watching. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our Greetings Earthling program. My name is Ian Edwards, and I'm the host and producer. Maybe you've heard this too, but it seems like phrases like climate anxiety are more prevalent today, with people genuinely emotionally disrupted by the confusion and threat of the climate impasse. In a conference about the human scale of the climate crisis, it seems like an exploration on the emotional toll is relevant here. And I, for one, wonder if our mental health is both an outcome due to and an obstacle because of the climate threat. And I'm hoping to explore that. And I called this panel Inherited Trauma, partly to latch on to some new and controversial thinking in the world of mental health, but also acknowledging the generations-old dis-ease we inherited from our predecessors. And while we didn't create this functional mess of climate change, it's our job to fix it. So I sense we are wallowing in trauma, and a better name for this panel might have been bequeathed trauma, something we might be able to discuss. Here to help us unravel some of this topic is Zhiwa Woodbury, former lawyer advocating for wildlife and wild places. He is now an eco-psychologist and spiritual counselor and author of a paper that inspired this panel. It's called Climate Trauma Towards a New Taxonomy of Trauma. We will get into some of that in the next hour, and there will be a link to his paper so you can see it yourself. Clarinda Mac Low is an artist and scientist working at the intersection of dance and molecular biology. She is co-founder and executive director of Culture Push, an experimental organization that links artistic practice with civic engagement. Her work, entitled Salvage Salvation, is a collaborative installation and performance project that explores the philosophical, emotional, material implications of reuse, discard, decay, and abundance. And lastly, we have clinical psychologist Michele Wick, who studies the human side of climate change through an interdisciplinary lens, including the psychosocial impacts of climate change and the psychological barriers that limit climate change action, so right on topic. Currently, she co-leads the interdisciplinary fellowship for a group of faculty and students at Smith College, where she works, called Imagining Climate Change from Slow Violence to Fast Hope. Thank you for joining us. And for regular Broto people, Michele has been with us since 2018 with our first in-person conference, sitting there in the audience. So she is a Broto lifer. So I'm happy to have her on a panel. So thank you again for joining us. First, I wanted to start with a study I found out of Italy from 2020. And so just bear with me for a second. Quote, slow change of the environment due to climate change, like changes in unusual weather or rising sea levels, will cause acute and chronic psychopathological trauma and shock, PTSD, depression, anxiety, suicide, substance alcohol abuse, aggressiveness, violence, difficulties in social and interpersonal relationships, loss of personally important places, altercation of social ties, loss of autonomy and control, as well as personal and professional identity, leading to the emergence of feelings of helplessness and fear and nostalgia and eco-anxiety. Yikes. That is a list. How do we get up in the morning, really? With all that, we have these mental health experts here. I wanted to set a baseline for mental health trends, and what is the state of it, specifically to the climate crisis? And are we worried? Do we have death anxieties? Can we generalize? Zhiwa, do you want to start from a conceptual point of view?
Sure. Well, first of all, that definition that you just read, or that quote you read, is kind of a good definition for climate trauma. I think biospheric trauma, that's how I would tend to characterize it, because it's basically making the point that we're not separate from the living organism on which we inhabit, which is the planet. And on the sort of issue of renaming the panel, I would actually think accumulated trauma would be a really good topic, because it's really important to emphasize the fact that trauma is cumulative. And that's kind of the idea of inherited trauma, that when trauma is not resolved, it persists and it becomes encoded in our relationships, including our relationship with ourselves and the relationship with the larger world, with nature. And so as far as where we are, I think everybody is feeling that cumulative trauma. It was first sort of discovered after the Holocaust, when psychologists were surprised to find that subsequent generations of survivors of the Holocaust had more severe symptoms of trauma than the people that actually survived the Holocaust. And so that gives you an idea, a very important idea, of how trauma gets passed on from generation to generation until it's resolved, right? And so unresolved trauma is the problem, and we're all suffering sort of a consequence right now of living in a world that has too much trauma accumulated at all levels, and the trauma of the planet is kind of coming home to our communities, our relationships, our political systems, our capitals, and we see it everywhere. And it's a result of, so as scary as that definition sounded, what's scarier is not actually acknowledging that, right, and living with the consequences of it not being resolved. It results in what I refer to as the 5 Ds. And I'll finish with that and let somebody else offer their comments. But the 5 Ds are being desensitized or distracted, demoralized and depressed, and engaging in sort of dissociative behaviors where you're not dealing with the real issues.
Clarinda, is there an art point of view to some of what Zhiwa is talking about, or something independently considered through the arts?
Well, I was thinking about that in terms of how we apprehend the trauma that we're feeling, or even the things that create the trauma, because a lot of what struck me in Zhiwa's paper is the idea of dissociation. And so a lot of what I do and what a lot of other artists do are just trying to surface the reality in a way that people can somehow absorb without rejecting and without having to dissociate. So finding a way to infiltrate consciousness in some way, in a way that doesn't trigger that kind of trauma reaction. So I feel like that is absolutely what I've been trying to do. I mean, salvage salvation is something I've been doing since 2002 in an iterative process. And it was somewhat a reaction to 9/11, but also to my sense of understanding climate change, actually, at that time. And saying that we have this fear of death and decay, and that's at the root of a lot of what we do, like consumption and production, and the need for new things, and all these things that I saw as a root of all the... So just trying to find a way for people to have an in to talking about how we use materials as a kind of sneaky way of talking about our fear of death and decay, both of which we have to accept if we're going to actually move on how to change climate, like the relationship to our like climate. And then also with Sunk Shore, where I use data, but in a kind of embodied way. And this is just me, and there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of artists doing this in so many different ways, in so many like really gorgeous, innovative, creative ways of thinking about how to just say, this is our reality, it's okay. Let's just see where we are. How can we accept this? So, I mean, and as with much art and other kinds of idealism, you know, it's a hope that we can somehow shift that.
Before I give Michele a chance here too, but I think that you work with dance, and you know, I always think that the physical movement of dance is connected to feelings in a way that maybe some other arts forms aren't, and that could be, I guess, debated. But I mean, you exercise your body, you exercise your spirit through motion, and I'm wondering if that gives you a particular perspective on mental health or climate change.
I mean, I think both. I think that if you are someone who's involved with movement arts, there is a way you experience the world, which is why you're in the movement arts, but then also it's honed. That is perhaps like we are so, especially within, I'll just say US culture, we are taught to divorce ourselves from our physical sensorium, right? And in many, many, many ways. And that's part of that dissociation. Like, I am depressed every spring because it comes too soon, because I feel it, you know, and I feel it in my body. And that, so you have to be able to integrate that sensorium, right? Like into your living in the world. But if you do that, then you do notice all these things that are traumatic. So I think that like the emotional thing, like the direct connection between emotion and movement art is like, no. But definitely the embodied, like people who would want to be somehow within the movement arts are going to have something in their bodies that it requires them to respond to the world that way. And I do think those tools that we learn about perception and taking in the world are really useful, and that's part of my secret project.
Well, thank you. I think you gave me a theme for our upcoming Broto. Sensorium sounds pretty good for a theme. Michele, how is climate change, anxiety, and depression and emotional toll showing up in the clinical and academic worlds?
Well, first of all, I really love the sensorium idea. So, like, oh, I'd love to take that one and work with it. I think my approach or my way of thinking is a little bit different. I'm coming at this from thinking about that there's a lot of different realities out there, and that people have a lot of different experiences of this very large issue. And, you know, some researchers talk about this as different pathways to how this climate change impacts people. So there's the pathway of large, very discrete events, floods, fires, huge fires that have very immediate impacts at that moment. We see increases in post-traumatic stress disorder. We see increases in suicidal ideation, depression, and so forth that are very much a response to those particular very discrete moments, these large-scale kinds of events. And then there are those slower, almost more difficult to see, but they're actually happening, is rising sea levels. I grew up on the ocean near the shore. You're in Provincetown. You know something's changing, but you don't see the abrupt, what I just read today, 90 miles of glacier was receding. They think, the glacier behind Denali is receding much faster than they planned. But you don't see that with the ocean sea level. So but at some point, it might displace people. So you might lose your home. You might literally lose your home. And then there's the diversity of, if you are a person of economic means, if you lose that home, you might have insurance that can replace that home, or you may not. So the differential impact that this is, yes, there's depression, there's all that list, but a lot of people don't see it this way. Not everybody's coming to these same discrete events and seeing them from the same perspective. And women, for instance, there seems to be greater impact from a mental health perspective when you have these kinds of events, slow or, immediate, quickly, those quick, large events. Frontline workers, people who experience the cleanup of whatever that kind is. And we talk about the trauma that, all the things that go with cleaning, with having to pick up the pieces afterwards. And then people in the BIPOC community, who already are starting with lack of resources, living within infrastructures that are slowly poisoning them. They're living, too many communities living right next to power plants and so forth. So I think that we have to be really careful about assigning a very broad sweep to this, that we have these differential impacts, and communities that already, from a mental health perspective, already don't have enough resources, available to them. And then you add this next layer to it. And substance abuse is another one where you see in response to some of these events. And we don't have enough, on-demand substance abuse, treatment already without cataclysm. So I could go on, but I won't. I'll stop there.
That's okay. So thank you. Yes, one of the themes that comes up in all of our panels is justice. A lot of people of economic means showing up with different kinds of privilege, etc. These are very prevalent themes in the content that we're covering this weekend. Zhiwa, I wanted you to give us a couple of highlights from this famous paper that we're talking about, just so that for people at home who don't actually read it, they've given they have a little bit of a taste for what it is.
Sure. So I've been sort of on a long journey to comprehend the basic paradox of humanity facing an existential threat and not taking appropriate action in response to that threat. And being in the, working in at the front lines of forest defense for decades, it just became really apparent to me that we were furiously addressing symptoms and nobody was actually addressing the disease or trying to identify the disease even. So I went off on a different career track to try to come to grips with that myself, to try to process my own difficult feelings around where we were heading. And I began by looking at it through the lens of cultural trauma and seeing that there was a distinct shift after World War II in what's generally referred to as the Great Acceleration, where all of these exponential population growth in everything that is associated with that, the disappearance of wildlife and sea life, but also the disconnection from the natural world. And it seemed to me that there was a fundamental shift after we split the atom and declared ourselves in charge of the natural forces of the world, you know, and started remaking the planet in our own sort of dysfunctional image. But at some point, you know, in my journey of trying to identify the way trauma was working to prevent us from responding. And so for people who are not familiar with sort of limbic system, you know, explanations, basically everyone knows that the response to trauma is sort of flight, fright, and fight, you know, one of those three things. And so we sort of, that's how you avoid resolving trauma, you know, and that's kind of what denial is like. And as I was sort of looking at all this from through a cultural standpoint, I mean, Donald Trump got elected, you know, and all of a sudden I just saw that even the level of trauma was accelerating, and everything, you know, in response to that, everything leading up to that and in response to it just was very overwhelming, which is also a very, the heart of trauma is feeling overwhelmed. And that was kind of the zeitgeist, you know, the time was overwhelmed. And then at the same time, seeing that all of a sudden people were bringing up traumas that had not been resolved, like through the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter. And I saw all of these unresolved traumas that seemed to be demanding resolution. And that's when it kind of occurred to me that there was something else going on. And that is that, you know, it's, once I sort of saw it, it seemed so obvious, but it took me a long time to get there. And that was that, well, of course, the planet's a living organism and we're part of that. And her life is being threatened, similar to, like, you know, really you can draw a parallel to George Floyd and us having our collective knee on Gaia's neck and she couldn't breathe, you know. I mean, it's sort of like, it feels like that to me, you know. And so once I sort of got out of my head, which is kind of the cultural view, and really dropped into my heart and felt that trauma, then I saw everything as sort of a symptom of that. And I realized that this overarching trauma that we're experiencing at a biospheric level is triggering all the other traumas that have not been resolved. And that's why the climate crisis involves, you know, as everything, you know, why all of the social justice issues are so critical to addressing the climate crisis, because it's those accumulated traumas, unresolved traumas, that are preventing us from actually acting collectively.
For our viewers at home, the program includes a sociology and anthropology panel that talks about some of the stratification that we're getting into here. There's also a philosophy panel, which I encourage a lot of people to tune into. Clarinda or Michele, do you have anything to respond to what Zhiwa is talking about? Collective trauma, is that a new fluid thing, or is this something you've been familiar with for a while?
What's coming through to my mind, and where I think like the discomfort for me is a hierarchy of traumas. And that's where I'm uncomfortable with placing climate above hierarchically, if I'm understanding this correctly, Zhiwa. Maybe I'm not. With the trauma that Indigenous people have felt, you know, have worked through, are living, or that Black Lives Matters represents, that, you know, that these are continuing, these are not over. And I don't think, for me, that it's because climate change has triggered them. It's because our society is structured in such a way that these traumas are, that we are continue with our racist ways, we continue with our misogynist ways, and so forth. And it's, you know, baked into the structure of our government, our economic system, our political system. It's not my area of expertise, but I think from a clinical perspective, if I was working with a client, I'd have to be working at those multiple levels and not thinking about climate as taking precedence, even though it's I spent a lot of time in that space looking and researching, because it's very, very important to me. But I wouldn't, from a clinical perspective, want to make it paramount. I'd want to start from where the person is to understand what is most important to them.
What if Mother Earth came to your office? What if Earth was on your couch? Would you recognize
What's that? If I don't think of the Earth quite in the same way, and right. It's really interesting, as I've been trying to think of myself as part of nature. That is something that I've been really working with, is thinking of humans as not separate from nature, but that we are organisms that are integrated, that we are made of the same organisms that the termites are made out of, but we have, you know, evolved these incredible brains. And when I was thinking about nature, there's brutality in nature. You know, that we have beavers nearby, and I actually have a great affection for beavers. But they create a living system. You know, they create homes without much thinking and care for the organisms that are around them. Yes, they create ecosystems that are, some thrive, but when those areas flood, there's whole groups of fauna and flora that go with them. And so even in the ecological systems that we are part of, there's a lot of brutality and self-orientation. So
that is such an interesting perspective. So I wanted to let Clarinda, you were going to step in with a comment, and I wanted to make sure you got your say.
Well, it's just that it's such a both and situation, because the same attitudes that led to racist capitalism and colonialism are the same attitudes that led to climate change, like that we can have power over in a certain way. I mean, humans are, I think that's just a definition of human. We seem to want to have power over. It's something I've been puzzling with since I was a child. Like, why do we want just enslave other people? Like, what is that about? Or other animals, or, you know, it's such a strange thing to do, and yet we can't seem to stop ourselves. But I think that there, with a certain kind of industrialized capitalism, which I consider starting with the development of the sugar trade, right? That was, so they're all of a piece, right? That this idea that you can conquer land, that you can make people into possessions, that you can biologicalize, if I may coin a terrible word, the differences between humans, which are like negligible genetically, but you try to do something, you know, all of these things are so interwoven that when we fight racism, we are in fact fighting climate change. When we, especially when we advocate for indigenous rights, we are directly, you know, fighting climate change. And when we fight climate change, we better be doing all those other things, or we're not actually fighting climate change. We're just kind of putting a Band-Aid over something. So I think it's a really interesting interplay, and it is, when you then come down to how the individual experiences it, it would be really interesting to me to see how people kind of within the caring professions are able to acknowledge all of those things at once. I know it's impossible, but it's like to say, like, yes, you are feeling the earth and you are also feeling injustice, and they are of a piece, kind of allows people to feel part of nature, you know, humans to be part of nature. It's also a language thing, like the way we construct language. I talk a lot about things that are real but not true, like race, you know, like the racialization of humans is like, it has become real, but it is not true. And the human and nature are separate has become real, but it is not true. So I always say human animals and non-human animals, or I say people who are feline, you know, like I try to play with the language and push it so that it shifts that how we think about our place in the world, in the planet, and in relationship to each other.
It's such a rich topic. I would say that on a personal note, I used to think that the remedy was massive, like that we would have to engineer something planet scale. I even did a Broto conference on it. I've come to go the opposite direction, to think that it's extremely personal. And that maybe explains why so many people have such a visceral reaction to this trauma or any other trauma that might be triggered by another trauma. I mean, it seems like we are, you know, as I said, wallowing in trauma. I guess wallowing would be a bad word. Suffering would be better. But I wonder if you've alluded to some of these questions, whether mental health might be the reason we don't act on climate, or vice versa. You know, which is the chicken and egg kind of thing. Any thoughts on that in your research, Zhiwa?
Well, first I do want to respond to the Michele's perception of a hierarchy of trauma. The idea of identifying and acknowledging biospheric trauma is not to create a hierarchy of importance and saying the trauma of the natural world is more important somehow than the trauma that I experience. Rather, it's to say that that the trauma of the natural world and the biosphere and of Gaia is my trauma. That my trauma is not separate from that trauma in the same way that I am not separate from her. And I think that what I've noticed a lot in talking about these issues over the last few years is that there seems to be a preponderance of women that feel that more closely than men. I tend to usually be on panels with women, and a lot of the people that are writing really important papers on this topic are women. And I don't think it's any coincidence that the Me Too movement was one of the first mass movements to rise up in this sort of traumatized era, because you can't distinguish between misogyny, patriarchy, and the destruction of nature. They're all the same attitude. And that's that attitude that perpetrates that power over everything that's feminine, I think actually connects the traumas, especially of women, with the trauma of Mother Nature.
I hear what you're saying, and that, some of that makes sense to me. I think my own anxiety rose when you were talking about the day-to-day, whether these are continual traumas. And I would argue that women, people, BIPOC people, indigenous people, marginalized people suffered continually and continue to do so now. And for many, those are much more prominent in terms of, distance, in terms of the distance, right now it's what they're experiencing most proximate to them. Not everybody, again, but I think for me that difference doesn't hold. That I think it's important for us to know that this work is not done, and those racism, misogyny, so forth impacts people every day, day in, day out. It's everywhere in terms of the person's lifetime, and I can't even understand it. I can understand the misogyny. I can't understand. I'm not a person of color, so I don't have that full experience, but I know what it's like to be, you know, a woman sometimes working out in the world. So that's the modification I would say. I think that's, for me, important.
And as you know from your work, Michele, the way all of this trauma is resolved is through relationship, because it arises in relationship, an abusive relationship, so it must be resolved in relationship as well. And so the idea of climate trauma is putting all of those traumas in sort of the same framework of saying, and we need to change our relationship with the natural world, as well as our relationship among the sexes and the patriarchal and the institutional racism. And it really, kind of what Clarinda was talking about earlier, it really is what's common to all of that is oppression. It's this idea of oppression. And it's not just Black lives that matter, it's Black countries that matter, because those same institutional oppressive mechanisms are at work at a global scale, which is why we all here enjoy such a privileged lifestyle and stuff, because the countries of color are being oppressed the same way the people of color are being oppressed here in the States.
Clarinda, do you want to respond to that? And then we'll get to wrapping up.
Actually, can I respond to something that came
Of course.
Okay.
Of course.
I am going to take issue with the essentialization of the feminine in this situation. I understand what you're getting at, but I do feel like that's a dangerous road to go down, because I feel like there are forces, they're often right now embodied maybe in female-bodied people, but I do think these are just forces, and they're not, and like, as someone who is childless, for example, my generative life is through art, and I'm not sure that, like, I relate to the fact that I am the feminine, you know, and I understand what you're saying, and I totally, like, in most cases, I totally agree, but I think it's really important to decouple these ideas of feminine from ideas of generation and care, because that is how we can all take on, regardless of our bodies, regardless of our gender identities or feelings or ways of being. And especially if you look at younger generations, that's all changing. It's just like all up in the air what it means, you know, the feminine, the masculine. That binary's gotta go, you know, and that, like, so I feel like all those things you're talking about, it's true. Again, it's like, it's real, but it's not true. But I wonder if there's a way to play with that. And again, I think this is where art comes in, is like play with that definition, push it in different directions, and say these forces of care and nurture and need to connect, those are human traits. Those are creature traits, you know, and how do we share them all together, if that makes sense?
It sure does. These always happen, these 40-minute recording sessions go by in a second. So I wanted to give you guys a last thoughts. One of the things that I've been trying to develop is this idea of climate hope. There's lots of work on the idea of hashtag climate hope. But I'm hoping that as a mental health practice, you could maybe explain whether it's actually aspirational, or is it therapeutic, or is it fanciful? Does climate hope exist? Who wants to go first?
I can go
Michele.
first. You know, again, I always come back to, if I was in a clinical setting, it would be in dialogue, as Zhiwa was talking about, in relationship with the client. So whether that hope is critical and important or destructive is really figured out in dialogue with the person and where they're working from. In general, I think hope is really important because people have to have a sense of efficacy. They have to have a sense of that they can do something, and that's a whole long conversation in of itself. But that idea that you can have no agency is, I think, very, very difficult to then drum up the energy to say, I'm going to work against all the things that I might be thinking, feeling, and experiencing in my life. I might have to change my life. I might have to do things really differently, but there's no hope. There's no hope that if I do that, that's going to change anything. So I think, we need that. And I also believe that hope is connected to resilience. And I actually believe humans are, maybe defiantly so, incredibly resilient. And illogically so sometimes, that we are incredibly resilient. And that work of art, I think we didn't have time to go through that, but I think art serves that purpose of allowing us to express some of that and work that through.
Zhiwa, you want to talk about climate hope? Is that something that you work with?
It's something that I can't avoid, actually. I think hope is a word like love. It has so many different uses and definitions and contexts and stuff. So you see it comes up a lot of times in ways that don't seem very constructive, and there's always this entanglement between hope and despair. So when people have unrealistic hope, it tends to lead pretty quickly to despair. And the main problem I find with that sort of that sort of focus is how future-oriented it is, when our problem is right now that we're not present-oriented enough, and we really need to be focusing on what is happening as opposed to what might happen in the future. Which is impossible to predict as a matter of science when you accept the idea that the Earth is a living organism that has its own responses, that we can't predict. What I have found is that hope tends to be a kind of proxy for faith, and we don't talk about faith much anymore, and in some ways we have a faith deficit because it's associated with religions, and the religions are all we're becoming less religious. But for me, there are things that I have faith in, and that's what sustains me without having to worry about predicting the future. And I have faith in nature itself, as Michele was saying, and the resilience of the natural world. It's really phenomenal. I have faith in human nature, that what's happening right now is that we're realizing that we've been acting against human nature for too long, and we're getting back to our own indigeneity and our own connections with the natural world. And I have faith, strangely enough, in the fact that in the newest generation. And the reason for that is because trauma is cumulative, and because it's passed on from generation to generation, we've gotten to a point where the new generations they can't take it anymore. It's reached such a threshold that they're calling it out, and they're saying, no, how can you accept this? How have you accepted this? And they're putting they're sort of putting our feet to the fire and forcing all the older generations to acknowledge that, yeah, we've kind of let this go too long. So the sort of activism of the younger generation, to me, is an indication that we've reached that threshold and that turning point, and that slowly we're going to turn this thing around.
So in honor of our artists in the audience, we skew quite heavily to the artists. I'm going to let Clarinda have the last word before we wrap up. Keep it short.
Yes. I think climate hope is what I work with all the time, basically. I agree but it is about how to be grounded in the present. So producing ideas about what can happen as a way to say, we can make this happen together. We don't know what will happen. But we can work on it together to imagine a new world.
That's a great way to end. And what I've learned through all of these sessions is that the more human you make the subject, the more the lack of consensus is amazing. People have a very, very disparate ideas of what it means to be human in this time. I want to say thank you to our panelists, and for viewers watching, we're going to pop up in a second to do some live continuation of the conversation and answer your questions. So stay tuned, and we'll see you in a second. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the live portion of the session. Everybody's accounted for. Thank you for your contributions to the panel. I wanted to start with some clarification, which is to say that when I first came across Zhiwa's paper, I was enamored with the expansive thinking that went into some of these concepts. And the paper that he wrote is ostensibly a critique of traditional psychology on this matter. So there is in this panel, we have a creative thinker and an academic thinker, and then there's a lovely bridge in between that I'm calling Clarinda, because she's synthesizing so many of these things. So I just wanted to set that straight, because it is an issue of respect. I dig the ideas, and they may not land always with the scientists, but that's part of the Broto experiment. We recorded this some weeks ago. I'm wondering if any of you have had any thoughts about the video or thoughts since that might be relevant. Okay, it was perfect. We did get some questions in the chat box, and there was some talk about from Rich, who is a friend of Broto. Listening to all this talk about trauma makes me think about how the greatest antidote is nature herself. Is that a paradox? I think, Zhiwa, you actually addressed this directly in your thinking.
Well, I think the great psychologist James Hillman was the first one to recognize climate change as Mother Nature calling us home. So it's kind of like the alarms are going off in the system that we're a part of, and it's pointing out to us that we've become, in our own minds and in our lifestyles, detached from the natural world in a way that's not sustainable. So yeah, it's just recognizing that symbiotic relationship of mother and child in a non-gendered way.
And Clarinda, do you have any thoughts on the paradox of nature being the remedy?
Clarinda, you're muted.
I think you're muted. Nope, not hearing you. We will get on this. Maybe we can ask you to reconnect and come back. Sorry about that. Michele, what is your thought on this?
I think there's a little bit of my mantra, as always. First part of my answer is it's really complicated, because I think nature, the concept of nature, just encompasses so many different elements. There's we as humans and all that makes, our physical selves, which I would argue is part, we are made up of the elements of nature, and we have these brains that one of the things we haven't talked about in this is sort of the neurological level here that gives us this incredible capacity to interact with our ecological systems around us. So that's, I think, part of where I've been struggling to find language that includes us as humans and allows us to talk about the non-human world, but that we're part of it. So I'm calling it ecological systems for the moment, and that might not be the best language. But, again, the complexity for me is that for some people, absolutely. There's really interesting, compelling research out there about experience in ecological systems, depending on, who you are and where you dwell and so forth. But ecological systems can be sources of trauma as well. Right. And in those moments that one has to parse out, which part of the ecological system is palliative and feels good, and which part of that system is actually inducing pain in a multitude of ways.
One of the ideas that has come up over the weekend is this idea of nature, romanticizing our relationship with nature, in that, yes, we're estranged from nature, or we don't understand nature, or we are sick because we are not connected with nature. But nature is cruel, and can be as cruel as it is beautiful. So I admire this, because we have members in our community who are very attuned to the idea of our estrangement from nature, especially the artists and a couple of our very active scientists. And it is a challenge to try and understand our relationship to nature in a way that doesn't oversimplify that relationship in the first place, and the human need to change our environment. Sorry, that rambled on a bit long. We are hoping that Clarinda comes back from a technical issue, and I want to make sure that we get to some other questions. Tim asks, is the trauma of climate change to nature, or is it to our human social orders? Something else we talk about, the idea that we are living by constructs not of nature, and that our reactions are to society and not nature. Michele, what is your reaction to the idea that we're
I'm chewing on the question. Again, I'm trying to figure out the change to nature or to our human social orders. Absolutely, the piece of it, of the human social order piece, in the proximate ways, changing climate crises are causing all kinds of issues around social order. Who has resources, who doesn't, who's competing for resources, and we already have limited resources in many ways. And I'm not just thinking of the United States here. I'm thinking, globally here. That in my little world here, you don't see it so much. I live in this lovely part of Western Massachusetts, but there clearly are places in the United States, even in Massachusetts, but where we're already seeing that sort of resource competition and the wars and the all kinds of outcomes from that. I'm looking as it is the trauma of climate change to nature, and again, I think this gets a little bit of what if you're personifying nature, I don't think, and I'm really working this out loud here, so whoever, I could be changed in 5 minutes from now from listening, but I'm not sure that nature is traumatized right now. That the ecological systems on the Earth have been changing for as long as the Earth has been in existence, if I understand the scientists that I work with. And so, we had, for a long time, the world was covered in, creatures that didn't breathe oxygen. And the worst thing that happened was that oxygen became this, ubiquitous, and all of those anaerobic creatures became extinct. So I feel like the Earth has been doing this for a long, long time. So I'm much more thinking about it in human terms. So.
Yes, and we have talked geological time, deep time, the idea that we live on a liquid Earth, and that
you know, it's always changing. Zhiwa, we have about 4 minutes before we end this portion and go off to our secondary post-panel session. Is it the social, are we reacting to social non-natural constructs?
You know, I think Michele addressed that. I actually wanted to end with the idea about nature being cruel. I think our attitudes toward nature are very interesting and obviously wrapped up in all of this. And I'm struck by, like, if you ever seen that movie, The Witch, about the family that gets expelled from Jamestown, like, wilderness appeared to them as this incredibly threatening, you know, life-threatening, scary expanse. And now our attitudes have changed to the point where wilderness sustains us. And we go into wilderness for sustenance and regeneration. And it's the same thing. Like I was raised with analyzing literature, like many types of literature were called man versus nature, you know, and the idea that somehow, you know, manifest destiny is about us battling nature. You know, you can see how we got into the mess we're in with those kind of attitudes. You know, the idea that nature is cruel. One of my formative experiences was doing a sort of a vision quest in old growth forest, and sitting in a forest grove and looking around me and seeing death everywhere I looked, and how much death was accepted and integrated into life in nature, while I was fighting the government that wanted to take all the dead trees out of, you know, oh, those are no good. We have to salvage the dead trees and get them out of there. Or humans that are always trying to get dead leaves off of their lawn, you know. Like, I think it's more, when we say nature is cruel, what we're really saying is we're going to die. We don't like that.
Okay.
And that's cool.
Did we get Clarinda back for a last hurrah?
No, but her talk about movement art, I think, is such an important piece of this, because culturally we're so disembodied, and we can't address trauma when you're in a disembodied state.
I 100% agree. So I'm gonna close this portion of the session, and I thank you very much to our guests, and hopefully we can get Clarinda back for the post panel and continue the conversation. I really have enjoyed this. I know how rich it is. I know how broad it is. It's rather new in a lot of ways. So I'm happy to introduce this to our audiences. So Matt, we can close this one up, and we'll open up the other meeting space, and we'll see you there in a couple of seconds.